Imagine a country that, for decades, stood carefully at the edges of the global stage. A nation that prided itself on keeping its options open, its alliances flexible, and its markets largely closed to the outside world. A country that played the long game, quietly, patiently, and on its own terms. Now imagine that same country, in the span of just 8 months, signing major deals with Cyprus, the United Kingdom, Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway, Switzerland, Oman, New Zealand, the European Union, the United States, Malaysia, and Greece, with Brazil and Canada actively in the pipeline. That country is India. And what we are witnessing right now may be one of the most consequential diplomatic transformations of the 21st century. Welcome to Frontline Reports. I'm Nico, and today we are taking a deep look at India's extraordinary run of deal-making, what is driving it, what it means for global trade and security, and whether we are truly witnessing the arrival of a new superpower on the world stage. To help us make sense of this remarkable moment, we have brought together three outstanding voices. Joining us online from New Delhi is a professor at Jindal Global University and director of the Center for Northeast Asian Studies. In the studio, we have a research fellow from the Institute for National Defense and Security Research and a fellow at the Taiwan Asia Exchange Foundation. Welcome to all three of you. Let us get into it. To understand why India has suddenly become the world's most sought-after partner, you have to understand both what India has become and what the world around it is becoming. For most of its post-independence history, India operated under a philosophy of strategic autonomy. Non-alignment was not just a foreign policy doctrine, it was a national identity. India would not be locked into the Western Bloc. It would not be pulled into the Soviet orbit. It would chart its own course, protect its own industries, and guard its sovereignty with the same intensity that it had fought to achieve it. For decades, that approach meant relatively closed markets, cautious diplomacy, and a reluctance to enter into binding trade agreements that might constrain domestic policy choices. But something has shifted, and it has shifted fast.
This is an old process that India has been trying to pursue, opening its market to countries in the West, moving from being a cautious, protective economy to an open market. That has been in the works for a very long time.
But what has accelerated it is that a growing number of countries are now actively moving away from China, looking for what you might call a China plus one model. And India is an absolutely perfect fit for that. The China Plus One model, for those unfamiliar with the term, refers to a business and investment strategy that companies and governments have increasingly adopted since the COVID-19 pandemic. The idea is simple. Rather than concentrating manufacturing, supply chains, or strategic dependencies entirely in China, you diversify. You keep China in the mix, but you add at least one other significant partner. And when global businesses, Western governments, and institutional investors look around for that additional partner, for somewhere with a massive workforce, a growing consumer market, a democratic political system, and a willingness to engage, India keeps coming up as the answer.
India is more pro-West than the West itself understands. These deals are just one of the indicators of that reality.
But there is a second factor at work beyond the China dimension, and it is arguably just as important. The United States, under the current administration, has become what many allies describe as an unpredictable partner. Trade tariffs have been imposed and threatened with little warning. Long-standing alliances have been tested. The traditional architecture of Western-led multilateral cooperation, the WTO, NATO, the G7 framework, has come under unprecedented strain. In that environment of uncertainty, middle powers, countries that are significant enough to matter, but not so large as to be threatening, have become extraordinarily valuable. And India, with its 1.4 billion people, its position as the world's fastest-growing major economy, and its strategic location at the heart of the Indo-Pacific, has emerged as perhaps the most valuable middle power of all.
I would always say that India is more pro-West than the West gives it credit for. And the China factor has absolutely accelerated that recognition.
Let us start with what is, on the surface, perhaps the most surprising of India's recent partnerships: Greece. In February of this year, Indian Defense Minister Rajat Singh and his Greek counterpart, Nikos Dendias, signed a joint declaration of intent covering defense industrial cooperation, alongside a bilateral military cooperation plan that maps out specific military engagements between the armed forces of both countries through 2026. The two nations also held their first ever joint maritime exercise in the Mediterranean Sea in September of last year, which notably included anti-submarine warfare drills. Now, why Greece? And why now? On the surface, India and Greece might seem like an unlikely pairing. They share no land border. They are not traditional allies. Their economies, while both significant, operate in very different geographies. So, what is the logic? The first part of the answer is Turkey. Turkey and Greece have one of the most fraught bilateral relationships in modern European history, a rivalry rooted in centuries of conflict and sharpened by contemporary disputes over territorial waters, airspace, and the status of Cyprus. And Turkey, in recent years, has deepened its strategic and military relationship with Pakistan, India's most persistent adversary. The principle here is ancient and universal. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Turkey's alignment with Pakistan gives India and Greece a natural common interest in checking Turkish influence and deepening their own defense cooperation. India has already provided Greece with Pinaka rocket systems and Tata armored infantry vehicles with mounted gun systems. According to multiple reports, India also offered a cruise missile last year, a significant move that signals the depth of the emerging defense relationship. But there is a second dimension to this partnership that goes beyond the Turkey-Pakistan equation, and that dimension involves China. Greece's largest and most strategically important port, Piraeus, is majority owned by COSCO Shipping, a Chinese state-owned enterprise. COSCO took over management of Piraeus in 2009 and has since expanded its control, turning the ancient Mediterranean port into the primary European entry point for Chinese goods moving along the Belt and Road Initiative's maritime corridor. That arrangement gives Beijing significant strategic leverage over a key piece of European infrastructure, and it creates what our New Delhi-based analyst describes as a strategic vulnerability for Greece, one that India has a direct interest in helping to address.
Here is why that matters for India specifically. Greece's Piraeus port is positioned as the European gateway of the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor, known as IMEC. This is a massive infrastructure project that links India to Europe via a combination of sea lanes and overland corridors through the Middle East. It is widely described as the West's most credible rival to China's Belt and Road Initiative. If IMEC is to function as intended, as a genuine alternative trade corridor that reduces dependence on China-controlled infrastructure, then having Piraeus firmly anchored in the Western strategic camp is essential. A port that is 67% owned by a Chinese state enterprise, at the critical European end of a corridor designed partly to compete with China, is a significant vulnerability. Building greater trust and political alignment with Greece, encouraging it to diversify away from Chinese infrastructure dependencies, that is a win for India. It makes Greece a more reliable European entry point, less susceptible to Beijing's influence. And it reinforces shared interests in a rules-based world order and maritime security. The deal, in other words, is not simply bilateral. It is a piece of a much larger strategic puzzle, one that connects India's Indo-Pacific concerns to European security, Middle Eastern connectivity, and the global competition between open and closed models of development. Even after what happened with the Panama Canal, having a foothold, having a deal, is always better than having nothing at all. If a Panama Canal-type scenario were to happen at Piraeus, at least the groundwork for an alternative response would already be in place.
And from the European side of the equation, the motivations are equally clear. Greece's defense minister described India as a key partner, a friend, and an upcoming superpower. That is not diplomatic pleasantry. It reflects a genuine recalibration of how European countries are thinking about their strategic options.
A number of countries, specifically in the West and in Europe, are looking toward India. The strategic rationale is clear. India is the most effective counterbalance to China that exists. The US has become unpredictable. US-EU relations are at a historic low. So what are the options for European countries? You can look to China, or you can look to India. And when European governments make that choice, I think there is simply more reliability with India. More alignment of values. More predictability. The US has actually lost significant ground in the Indo-Pacific. India and Japan are increasingly taking center stage. And if a European country needs to cooperate with a major Asian power, if it has to choose, it will choose India over China. I don't think there is really any doubt about that.
If the Greece defense agreement was significant, the India-EU trade deal signed in January of this year was historic. Described by multiple analysts as the mother of all trade deals, the agreement gives India preferential access to all 27 EU member states, a single market of over 400 million consumers with a combined GDP of more than 17 trillion US dollars.
For India, it represents the culmination of negotiations that began over 2 decades ago and collapsed multiple times under the weight of disagreements over market access, intellectual property, and the protection of Indian industries. The fact that those negotiations were finally concluded, and concluded successfully, tells you something important about how much the global environment has changed.
For European businesses, the deal opens a door into one of the world's fastest-growing consumer markets. India's middle class is expanding rapidly. Demand for European goods, from pharmaceuticals and machinery to consumer goods and financial services, is growing. And the EU, increasingly anxious about its own overdependence on Chinese supply chains and markets, needed to diversify.
For India, the deal provides what every growing economy ultimately needs: guaranteed access to large, wealthy, stable markets for its exports. Indian textiles, pharmaceuticals, software services, engineering goods, and agricultural products can now reach European consumers with significantly reduced barriers.
And beyond the economics, the deal sends a powerful geopolitical signal that India is no longer an observer on the margins of the global trading system. It is a full participant, negotiating on equal terms with the world's most powerful trading bloc.
The US immediately came in and wanted to sign a trade pact, because it was realized that India is a country which cannot be wished away. The EU deal demonstrated India's leverage, and the Americans took notice.
Which brings us, naturally, to Washington. In the days following the EU deal, India and the United States announced what was described as an interim trade agreement, the product of months of intensive negotiations that involved not just trade representatives but the two countries' leaders themselves.
It was an honor to speak with Prime Minister Modi of India. He is one of my greatest friends and a powerful and respected leader of his country. We spoke about many things, including trade and ending the war between Russia and Ukraine. He agreed to stop buying Russian oil and to buy much more from the US. Effective immediately, we agreed to a trade deal between the US and India, whereby we will charge a reduced reciprocal tariff, lowering it from 25% to 18%. They will likewise move to reduce their tariffs and non-tariff barriers against the United States to zero. The Prime Minister also committed to buy American products at a much higher level, including over $500 billion of US energy, technology, agriculture, coal, and many other products.
It sounds decisive. It sounds transformative. And in some ways, it is. But as with most things in international trade, the details matter enormously. And in the days after Trump's announcement, a careful reading of the official joint fact sheet revealed some very significant modifications to what the U.S. president had described. 4 key changes were quietly incorporated. First, the language on pulses, a crucial agricultural category that includes lentils, chickpeas, and beans, which are dietary staples for hundreds of millions of Indians, was removed from the provisions requiring India to eliminate or reduce tariffs. Pulses are now specifically protected. Second, the word commits, as in India commits to buy more American products, was replaced with the word intends. In the language of international diplomacy, that is not a cosmetic change. Commits is binding. Intends is aspirational. One creates a legal and political obligation. The other leaves room. Third, a specific reference to U.S. agricultural goods was removed from the list of sectors where India would reduce barriers. Fourth, on the contentious question of India's digital services tax, a levy that India applies to major U.S. technology companies, including Facebook, Google, and Amazon, the language shifted from India agreeing to remove the tax to India agreeing to negotiate a robust set of bilateral digital trade rules. Once again, a very different proposition. So what do these changes actually mean?
It is a big diplomatic and economic win for India. The word intends is non-binding language. It keeps the door open for future increased imports if there are benefits, but it removes any sense of hard obligation or quota that could pressure Indian policymakers or expose the deal to domestic political criticism. India retains full flexibility and sovereignty over its import decisions. That deletion is excellent news. Pulses remain fully protected. No tariff reductions, no market access openings for US pulses. That is a win. That preserves India's policy autonomy in one of the highest growth areas of the economy. The DST is a key tool for ensuring that global technology giants, Google, Meta, Amazon, pay taxes in the jurisdictions where they actually create value. Protecting that instrument was important.
The overall picture, our analyst concludes, is one of India negotiating with considerable skill and leverage, securing the headline benefit of a reduced tariff rate while quietly protecting the sectors that matter most domestically. But what about the critics? Because there have been critics, particularly within India itself. Some agricultural advocacy groups and opposition politicians have argued that Indian farmers were not adequately protected in the negotiations, that the deal opens the door to a flood of cheap American agricultural imports that could undercut Indian producers.
Farmers have been adequately protected. Unfortunately, we live in a digital age where multiple competing narratives circulate simultaneously. India is an agrarian country, and there will always be concerns raised about agriculture in any trade negotiation. But the government has been absolutely clear, through official statements and Commerce Ministry releases, that pulses specifically were never going to be on the table. They are a politically ultra-sensitive category, directly tied to the livelihoods of millions of farming families. No meaningful concession was given on pulses. The fears being circulated are, in my assessment, premature, and they don't account for the fact that this is still an interim agreement that hasn't even come into force yet.
India is cautiously calibrating its opening. Liberalization is happening, but it is measured, it is deliberate, and it is not happening at the cost of politically sensitive areas. India's interest comes first. That has been the consistent message from the leadership.
There is, however, one element of the U.S.-India deal that raises genuinely complex questions, and that is the reported commitment by India to stop purchasing Russian oil. Russia has been one of India's most important oil suppliers since Western sanctions were imposed following the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. India, which has consistently refused to formally condemn Russia's military actions and has maintained robust diplomatic and economic ties with Moscow, became one of the largest buyers of discounted Russian crude, purchasing oil at well below market rates, and in some cases, reportedly refining and re-exporting it to third countries. This was, for India, an enormously practical arrangement. Russian oil was cheap, it helped manage inflation, it generated revenue, and it fit within India's long-held doctrine of strategic autonomy, the principle that India would not be dictated to by any external power about who it could or could not trade with. So when Trump announced that India had agreed to stop buying Russian oil, with the implicit suggestion that this commitment was part of the trade deal, it raised immediate questions. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov was quick to note publicly that no such commitment had come directly from India itself, which is significant. Because if India had genuinely made that commitment, you would expect it to say so clearly.
I was genuinely surprised that India apparently agreed to refuse Russian oil imports. India has been getting huge economic benefit from that arrangement, not just in terms of direct energy costs, but in terms of the trade revenues it generates. And if you think about Trump's suggestion that India should buy oil from Venezuela or the United States instead, the distance from South America to India is enormous. The logistics cost would be substantially higher. It would simply not be in India's national interest. I think Trump's broader grand strategy is to pressure Russia into ending the war in Ukraine, to force Moscow to negotiate. Getting India, which has maintained friendly relations with Russia throughout the conflict, to reduce its oil purchases would add meaningful economic pressure on Moscow. China has refused to stop importing Russian energy. If India does so, or even credibly signals that it might, that changes the calculus somewhat.
The key question is whether India actually made a firm commitment, or whether, consistent with its broader negotiating pattern in these deals, it used carefully non-binding language that preserves its flexibility while giving the U.S. administration something it can present as a diplomatic victory. Given the pattern we have seen across the other elements of the deal, many analysts suspect the latter. For several years, India-Canada relations were in a state of deep freeze. The tensions reached their peak under former Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, whose government publicly alleged Indian government involvement in the killing of a Canadian Sikh separatist leader on Canadian soil in 2023. India rejected the allegations categorically. Diplomatic expulsions followed. Trade talks were suspended. What had been a warm and growing relationship suddenly became one of the most strained bilateral relationships in India's diplomatic history. Then came Mark Carney. Carney, the former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, won the Canadian federal election earlier this year and has quickly established himself as one of the most consequential new leaders on the global stage. His speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos attracted international attention for what was widely perceived as a direct challenge to the Trump administration's economic nationalism. A call for middle powers to stand together to resist economic coercion and to build resilience through cooperation.
What Carney said in Davos is essentially what India has already been doing for the past year. All the free trade agreements we have discussed, with the EU, with the US, with Greece and others, these are clear demonstrations of how middle powers can actively engage with each other and build durable partnerships. It doesn't have to be the two great powers, both of whom are currently unreliable, driving the global agenda.
From an Indian perspective, Carney's speech resonated because it echoed what India has been articulating through its actions for the better part of a decade. India's multi-alignment strategy, maintaining relationships with multiple major powers simultaneously, refusing to be locked into any single bloc, and building coalitions based on shared interests rather than permanent alliances, is precisely the kind of approach that Carney appeared to be advocating for middle powers more broadly.
With 1.4 billion people and the fastest-growing major economy in the world, Carney's blueprint for resilience and diversification is one that India actually already exemplifies in practice. If you want to see what middle power solidarity looks like in action, look at what India has been doing. India and Canada were never supposed to be adversaries. They fought, but the underlying interests were always aligned. I think this is a very affirmative, very positive development. Canada is beginning to speak India's language, but India is not going to rush into anything. Whatever partnership emerges has to be based on specific issues, specific interests. India will not accept anything that looks like a formal alliance structure. It will be transactional, issue-based, and grounded in mutual benefit.
In other words, the thaw is real. But the relationship will be rebuilt carefully, deal by deal, with India maintaining its customary insistence on strategic independence. It is impossible to discuss any dimension of India's current diplomatic surge without addressing the country whose shadow falls across all of it: China. India and China share the world's longest disputed land border, a high-altitude frontier across the Himalayas, where the two armies came to blows in 2020, resulting in the deaths of soldiers on both sides in the deadliest clash between the two countries in decades. Since then, the